Good morning. My name is Larry Jacobs. I am a professor at the University of Minnesota, and I also direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And I want to welcome you to the third annual Certificate in Election Administration Conference, preparing for the 2024 elections. Before we get started with the conference, I want to just give you a few words about the Certificate in Election Administration, or for short, CEA. CEA is a pioneering online academic program that provides comprehensive training in election administration at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Our mission is to expand professional expertise in the field of election administration and to prepare the next generation of election administrators by building a pipeline of new talent into the field. We welcome current election officials who are eager for professional development, and we are creating learning opportunities for those who are new to the field. The students in the program gain knowledge about the best practices in the field, and they also come to develop skill sets that are critical for navigating the challenges and the opportunities in election administration today. We're also pleased to provide free educational events like today's conference that brings together experienced election officials and policymakers to explore current issues facing election administrators. Now, just a couple quick things here before we get started, which is momentarily. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. That's your opportunity to participate. Just click it, give us questions. Please give us questions. We welcome that. It's a great way to make this experience interactive. And also the questions you raise are often questions that other folks are thinking about. If you'd like to have live captioning, that is also available. You'll see at the bottom of your screen. Again, welcome to the third annual Certificate in Election Administration Conference, preparing for the 2024 elections. We're delighted to bring you a series of panels that will explore actionable, practical information for election administrators that can be applied to the upcoming 2024 elections. I want to talk about three different panels. We're going to start off hearing from a panel of local election officials about strategies and programs they have enacted with minimal or no funding to increase access, turnout, and voter education in their jurisdictions. Then we're going to hear from a NFL analyst and consultant, Scott Pioli, and Harvard Ash Center's Tova Wang, about an innovative program they created to use sports stadiums as polling places. Very much looking forward to that. And lastly, we have a terrific panel of federal policymakers that are going to give us the lay of the land about funding and support that is available for the upcoming elections. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Judd Choate. Judd is Director of Elections for Colorado, and he's an instrumental part of the CEA program as a faculty member, chair of our advisory board, and organizer of this program. Thank you very much, Judd.
I am joining by my phone because, of course, it's election season, so why not have a major technology issue, but we'll get through it. So I'm really excited by this panel, and then we have two others later today. This one in particular is about trying to find inexpensive and relatively straightforward ways to improve your elections kind of at the last minute, things you can do in the several weeks prior to an election or months prior to an election that don't require a statutory change and don't require significant amounts of money or personnel. And there's variations to that, but basically these are things that you can do without getting a ton of approval from bosses or from the legislature, and then also not writing a big check. So that was sort of the design around this particular panel. And I'm really excited that we have three panelists that can really walk us through some ideas. The first is Maysa Sitar, who is the jail voting specialist at the Denver election office here in Denver, Colorado. I am also in Denver, Colorado. And she's going to walk us through one of the sort of growing areas of interest in elections administration, and that is how do we get to and involve people who are currently confined but are otherwise eligible, which for the vast majority of people who are confined, that's the case. So let me turn it over to Maysa so that she can walk you through her presentation. And hopefully in that 8 to 10 minutes, I can join you by the actual webinar. So Maysa, why don't I hand it to you?
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Maysa. I'm the Voter Accessibility Administrator for the Denver Election Division. I'm going to talk today about jail-based voting. I'll talk a little bit about why it's difficult to vote from jail, what our process in Denver looks like now, and then what some easy, free things that you can do if you're interested in implementing this program on your end. So first and foremost, why is it difficult to vote from jail? There are quite a few challenges. There's pretty slow mail access in jail. So the USPS, all mail is required to be screened coming in and out. And so that delays ballots significantly. Voters also don't have internet access in jail. They don't have access to email. They frequently have to pay if they want to use their phone, if they want to make a call. They often have limited access to forms of identification, which are required for voting typically. All of these above reasons make it very hard to cure their absentee ballots if they're able to get one. They have limited information access, so it's difficult to know when an election is and then who's on the ballot and how they would like to vote. And then one of the biggest challenges is that they're unsure of their eligibility. And many are afraid of further prosecution if they register to vote or vote and they're not allowed to. So I want to touch on some of the data we've gathered to kind of answer the question, are there actually people that are being disenfranchised? Are there people in jail who want to vote and are unable to? So on our end, in 2023, we had 187 people who voted at our in-person events. We found that 77% of them were either new voters or needed updates to their record. That trend continued in 2024 with about 85% of our voters being either new voters or needing updates to their record. And this indicated to us that there were voters in jail who wanted to vote and were unable to vote otherwise. These are voters who would not have been able to receive a ballot, who would not have been able to vote had we not gone in those first few days, that first week before the election to provide them ballots. So it was clear that in Denver County, this issue was apparent, and that's why we created a process to conduct in-person voting in the jails. So a little background on the program. It began in 2016, spearheaded by an NGO in Colorado called Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. Our jail-based in-person voting began in November 2020. It was paused for COVID and then restarted in 2023, and we continue it this year as well. We have voter registration events held monthly. And then just this last month, Colorado Senate Bill 72 was passed, which mandates in-person voting for every jail in the state. And so we'll see that happening in November 2024. And the process that I'm going to outline for you today is the process that is outlined in the bill. So if you're interested in that, I would really recommend taking a look at that bill. So I'll cover the processes and challenges. Just to reiterate that there are a lot of people in jail who are pretrial or who have a misdemeanor. In most states, you can vote with a misdemeanor while in jail. There's just a few that you can't. And in all states, you can vote if you're pretrial because you haven't been convicted yet. There's a really high number of people who are pretrial, and about 60% of them are actually unable to leave jail because they can't pay bail. So our process, our voter registration events, to give you an idea, take about 2 to 4 hours per facility. We usually send 2 to 3 poll workers, and there's about 1 jail administrator. Our in-person voting events last 5 to 12 hours per facility. So that really depends on how long the ballots are. Denver tends to have very long ballots, so it certainly goes a lot faster if you only have a 1-page ballot. It depends on voting method, jail population size, and we just add a staff member to that to make it go a little bit faster. Our voting process, we first have the voter go through an eligibility zone, make sure that they're eligible at the time of voting, and then we split them into in-county voters or out-of-county voters. Out-of-county voters, we provide a statewide ballot, which allows them to just vote on the statewide races. And we also provide all of our voters the option to, we provide them a mail ballot. So they have the option to vote it right then, or they have the option to take it with them and think about it a little longer. That decision was made because we had about half of our voters who were interested in voting their mail ballot later on. Many of them still returned their mail ballot. We provided them an easy way to do so, but they were very interested in the choice to take some more time to think about their vote. So despite providing mail ballots, one of the biggest benefits to in-person interactions is that real-time eligibility check. Voters are able to vote at a time that they know they are eligible. Eligibility changes very rapidly for people in jail. So it's important that they are aware of their ability to vote at the time that they're voting. We also found way fewer voter registration form errors. You're able to talk to those voters one-on-one. Pre-challenge voters can provide documentation like IDs or a signature if they don't have one on file. And then of course, we're able to answer questions for those voters and establish trust with that population. So these are some of the challenges that we have encountered, and that if you do a program like this in your state, you may encounter as well. I'll cover some of the solutions. For that eligibility, we did a real-time eligibility check. Every state has a Department of Corrections database, and it's often public record. And we were able to check the voters' eligibility at that moment. Acceptable IDs, Colorado law allows for a confined voter-specific ID, but it's pretty easy to work with your sheriff to develop an ID that works for those voters and that they're able to have. There's also a high number of out-of-county and unhoused voters. So we used that statewide ballot and then worked within the confines of the law and with the voters to identify a residence for them. A question you'll likely have to answer if you do a program like this is whether the jail can be used as a voting location or precinct. And then some of the biggest challenges we encountered are jail policies and procedures. Voters often can't move from floor to floor. There's typically required separation between inmates. There are a lot of time constraints and equipment constraints. And so all of those need to be problem solved. We made our VSPC, our voting site, very mobile so that we could move from floor to floor. We tend to bring in voters by pod. We want to get all of our voting equipment approved ahead of time. So those are just some practical solutions that made it a lot easier for us to implement this. And then, of course, voters have limited information access. And I'll talk a little bit about providing a toll-free election phone number in a bit. So another important consideration for us was selecting the right poll workers. We tend to draw from volunteer organization staff. They're often already cleared to go in the jail, and they often already work with these populations. So they're great people to work with. And then we pulled from some of our more experienced poll workers, and we did so well in advance that we can make sure that they are cleared in time to get into the jail facilities. I'll touch very briefly on safety and security. I just want to say that since 2016, we have had 0 safety incidents at any of our voter registration events or in-person events. This is a concern that I hear very frequently from people. And I like to say that I personally feel pretty safe because I know that everyone has been checked for weapons. I know that everyone is incentivized to be on their best behavior. And so I actually feel safer there than I feel sometimes in the general public. And then the last thing I'll touch on is just that this is a widely applicable program, regardless of what state you live in, regardless of what your state laws are. So if you do live in a state that allows mail-in or absentee voting, we found that it's very helpful to deliver mail ballots early and directly to the jail to avoid those USPS delays. We also found that it was very helpful to provide a sample voter registration form to avoid a lot of those time-consuming mistakes that you have to interact back and forth with the voter via USPS. And we typically encourage the voters to update their mailing or absentee address to the jail during election time if they're going to be in the jail at that time. For in-person events, if you're an in-person only state, or if you would be interested in conducting in-person voting in your jail, A few ways to make it a little bit more efficient is just providing those sample ballots and any informational booklets you're able to provide a few days in advance or to voters in line so that they know who they want to vote for when they get to the front. Asking them to complete their registration forms, have their ID documentation ready, or working with the sheriff's department to make sure that that documentation is going to go quickly and smoothly in advance. And then just determining what IDs are going to be acceptable and available for voters in the jail ahead of time. And then a few other things that you can do now for free are reach out to NGOs already working in the jail. This creates a greater work distribution. Typically these NGOs are already cleared and they already work with these populations. So they're well trained in how they need to interact with a vulnerable population. Also establishing a relationship ahead of time with your local jail sheriff's department. We found that time really builds trust. Sometimes the sheriff department and the local NGOs don't have the best relationship, but as a fellow governmental agency, you can form a relationship that is a little bit easier to work with. It's also very helpful to request an election division phone number be made toll-free for inmates. This is something that we found was free and easy and quick, and the sheriff's department had no problem doing. It just makes it easier for them to be able to call you and ask about their ballot, ask about their voter registration. It's kind of something you can do at the very bare minimum. An NGO also created a quick eligibility checklist for voters. This was super helpful because voters can kind of come and already be able to apply their situation to the eligibility without you having to explain it over and over again to each person. And then the biggest thing that we found is helpful is just asking voters in jail what they need. For those of us who have not been in jail, it can be hard to predict what it looks like in there, what they're actually able to access. Everyone's situation is different and every jail is different. And so asking voters in jail what the voting process looks like for them right now is a really great place to start. And then this is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about this more or share any information that would be helpful.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Maysa. That was really informative. And I just as a note in Colorado, I think we have one of the more sort of progressive programs already prior to this law, and we were still seeing incredibly low turnout numbers from that population. So even if you sort of think to yourself, well, we have a state that's sort of conducive to this population, or we can sort of jerry rig what we've got to sort of boost those numbers. That's just really not the case. You need something special, dedicated, and what Maysa just walked you through is basically how you do that. So fantastic. Thank you very much, Maysa. As you can see, I am on video now. However, I switched to my personal computer, which I should have done about a half an hour ago. So that's my fail. Let's move to Tommy Gong. So Tommy joins us. I think actually he joins us from New York State today, but he's from California. And Tommy's going to talk to us about working together with colleagues across a region or state to come up with ways to tackle mis and disinformation about election processes. So let me hand it over to Tommy.
Great. Thanks a lot, Judd. Again, my name is Tommy Gong, and I am the Deputy County Clerk Recorder for Contra Costa County in the San Francisco Bay Area. Let me go ahead and share my Okay, so real quickly, when I've been in 3 different counties over the years, and one of the things I was in a Central Coast county, and it was much more isolated. I think I shared one media source with a neighboring county. And so when I landed in the Bay Area in Contra Costa, I realized that there are many, many different news stations and newspapers that cover the gamut of the Bay Area, whether it's as far north as Napa, as far south as Santa Cruz, and as far east as Contra Costa, that we all share the same media market. So I thought maybe there's a way that we can work together, especially after the 2020 election, with the mis and disinformation that we were all dealing with. And so we proposed forming this coalition of Bay Area election officials. All collectively, we represent over 4.3 million voters in our Bay Area. And our mission is to collaborate, communicate, and provide accurate, current, and transparent elections information in our shared media market across the Bay Area. You can see all of the counties below that have participated. And in this way, we're really working together. And so some of the things that we did was we created fact sheets that cover such things as vote by mail voting, the voting system, and the canvas. And one of the things we learned is we really want to be able to simplify the message for the voter. So you can see some of the things to the right on our fact sheet for the official canvas. Instead of all of the different requirements that we're required to do during the canvas, we distilled it down to 4 critical tasks: count every eligible ballot, ensure voters only voted once, confirm proper procedures were followed, and verify the voting system is properly counting ballots. Next to that, just towards the center, you can see these infographics that were created. Now, these are rather recently. I should share that the coalition was started in 2022 at the beginning of the year, so that we've had a few years to be able to mature this group of our counties. And so after our 22 cycle in 2023, I asked Jennifer Morrell of the election group to do a facilitation between the 11 counties to say, this is what we accomplished in 2022. What do we want to do for 2024? And so some of the items that were created was, what are the themes that we believe we receive from our voters that express concern about our election process, such as, how do I know my vote was counted? And why does it take so long to count the votes? And so we created these infographics with the election group help. The election group, by the way, provides services free of charge to counties. And so again, that's just one more benefit of things that we discovered as we were creating this coalition. And lastly, I'd just like to share that the coalition was the winner of the 2022 Democracy Award with the Election Center. Very proud to have received that. So the next is, and this is something that goes beyond it, the beginning of 2024, we were asked by the Stanford D School, the design school at Stanford, if we would be willing to collaborate with them during a winter quarter course called Designing for Democracy. And we would work with the students in some way, shape, or form. And so we did 2 sprints, they call it design sprints. And one was, you can see in the middle of the screen here, our election security safeguards. This is something we put together in 2022. Very rapidly we did, and we did it with the help with CISA and other folks. And so there are 48 different safeguards there, and who is going to read all of those 48 safeguards? And so we wanted, our first request was for the students to reimagine this poster and find a way that we could communicate with the public very quickly about what are the things that they need to understand about the elections. And so below, you can see these 3 posters that the students created that we're considering utilizing for the November election collectively. Again, we figured that having a unified voice, communicating with the media, that we can actually get a bigger bang for our buck if we're always delivering the same message as our neighboring county is. And so with the help of UC San Diego and the MIT Election Data Lab and the Election Trust Initiative, we're going to be testing these 3 posters with public opinion polls throughout the greater Bay Area. And the image that tests the highest will be the one that we would be utilized for a unified campaign by all of our counties during the November election. And then the second design sprint was it was more open for the students to consider how might we increase public trust in elections. And so here are some of the things that they considered. One is, and we're very excited about, a first-time voter mail package as a rite of passage, like welcoming pre-registered students who are 16 or 17 in California and welcoming them as being a future voter. And so that's something we're really excited about in terms of creating those packages, and whether it's something that's actually physical or or electronic. Also, to the bottom left, we were very excited to see that reimagining a graphic of a young lady from our old Uncle Sam, I want you to recruit you to be to be recruited into the Army, that we want you to become an election observer or even a voter. And it was really intriguing to hear it from the student, what they did in order to soften the look, right? As a younger person, that we think that this is a way that we can engage our students and our future voters into the process. So I just want to share that how can someone get this all done in such a short period of time? And I'll just share that this is really something that has grown over a couple years. And what I recommend now to counties is to talk to your neighbors, your neighboring county election office, in case you haven't done so already. Find opportunities where you can share the same messaging. You can even develop stronger messaging between you and your neighboring counties. But find these opportunities, because I think you're going to find that there's much more in common that we have than we have that is different, and that we're going to just feel stronger being able to deliver that message to the public in terms of trust in elections. We recognize that the public knows very little about what we do in elections. So it's upon us to educate the public about what we do, because if we're not providing that information, then they can really be victimized to the mis and disinformation out there. And so I just want to leave you with that message. I think there's still less than 6 months away from our November election. And I think during the summer, I think there can be some strong alliances between neighboring counties to work together. So I encourage you to do so. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tommy. So I don't want to jump into questions, but I'm curious, did you have a winner? So you had the 3 options. Did you come up with a winner, and is that known yet?
It is not known yet. We're going to be doing this testing in June. It can be done fairly quickly with our college researchers. And so that's what we're really planning to do in that way. I will say that as far as the election officials are concerned, the iceberg seems to really be the one that really resonated with election officials, in that, beneath the surface elections, voting is only the tip of the iceberg. And so we're trying to find a way that maybe that's the way that we can communicate with the public to find out more. Then they can click on the link and find out more information about elections as they need to. And so that is just, I know that's something that's resonating in us, but we're going to need to do the testing and really see what data provides to us in advising us what image is the strongest.
Yeah, and it may be that the thing that works the best for you doesn't work for the public. So but I like the iceberg as well. First of all, it's very visually pleasing, and then obviously symbolic of the work that we do. Great. Thank you very much, Tommy. Appreciate it. Now I'm going to jump to Michael Siegrist, who is joining us from Michigan. And he's going to talk to us about, I sort of approached Michael and said, hey, Michael, I really love the way you use social media to kind of get the word out on the various things that are happening in Canton elections. And I wanted to know if that's something maybe that can be a model for other jurisdictions. So, Michael, can you tell us about your program?
Yes, most definitely. Thank you, Judd. It's an honor to be here. As Judd indicated, I'm Michael Siegrist. I'm the clerk in Canton Township, and I'm going to get my presentation up and ready to go. Let me get it in presenting mode. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right.
So you're in presentation mode, but if you have a second screen, if you could shift to the second screen, then
Let me try that. I have 3 monitors, so
yeah, it's funny. You would think multiple monitors would help you in these circumstances, but they actually hurt you because you end up showing the wrong monitor. I've done this like a million times. There you go.
better?
Yep.
All right, excellent. So our presentation is using active and passive communication to help kind of voters understand the elections process in a way that's relevant to their life with a voter-centric kind of view, because I think that that's where we've been successful in Canton Township, by stepping into the shoes of the voter. And the reason I say that is because one of my favorite quotes, something I picked up a long time ago about non-election related stuff, but that voters think about elections as often as we think about broccoli. Which is not that frequently, and usually just before I'm about to eat some broccoli, which is, voters don't typically make plans, might not check registration status, might be unfamiliar with the process. And so most of our communications along with our processes aren't really designed around the low information folks. Even states that have super inclusive systems still have multiple steps towards obtaining a ballot, voting that ballot, and submitting that ballot so that it's tabulated. And I think that I use that to inform every decision we make in my office, along with how we communicate with voters. For folks who are attending from abroad, Michigan is one of the few states that administers elections at the hyperlocal level. We have 1,520 local election officials or local election jurisdictions. Canton is the 9th largest in the state of Michigan. We have just under 80,000 registered voters, which is the 8th highest voter registration in the state. Michigan is a vote in place state on election day. So I do have 33 precincts at 12 voting locations. My community, pretty diverse. We have the 3rd highest Asian American population at 19.1%, and over 20% of Canton Township was born outside of the United States of America and immigrated here. Arabic is the most common language other than English spoken in Canton. So first, in kind of how we handle the communication, in 2020, we wanted to provide language assistance. We are not a VRA covered community for purposes of Section 203. So there's no requirement to provide foreign language assistance over and above kind of the basic level. But we wanted to do that with poll workers. And so a super cheap, actually a completely free way we went about doing that was documenting the poll workers who we had hired, their ability to speak languages other than English. And then I worked with our local school districts to obtain the English language learner information at the elementary level. Because our elementary schools in Michigan are neighborhood schools, and that gave us a pretty good geographic indicator of where the languages were spoken inside of the community. And so this is not an additional software. This is not a GIS component that we had to use. We had to pay nothing for this. We just essentially found out which languages were spoken in which of the neighborhood schools, and then laid those boundaries over our precincts, and then assigned poll workers accordingly. It was super helpful, super impactful. For purposes of having assistance under AVA. In 2022, we went a little bit deeper. I obtained our Section 203 numbers, and then had to learn kind of how to interpret those. The census website has that information. If you've never looked at it, it might be cool to look at the numbers inside your community to get a feel for what languages you would be covered if they were at that threshold level. Again, keep in mind, these are going to be the languages that are just covered under the 1975 law. So like Arabic is not going to be on here. Any of the European languages will not be on here. So, but I blended both of those kind of data, and what we did is we started providing signage and instructions in other languages. So this is helpful to ensure that we have access for all voters in Canton Township. The second part for communication is a program that we implemented for early voting, early in-person voting in Canton Township. 2024 is the pilot year for early in-person voting for the state of Michigan. Our election system has kind of drastically changed. We now have no reason absentee. Also, we have automatic absentee. So if you opt in, you can essentially become a mail voter in perpetuity in Michigan. And now we also have a mandatory minimum of 9 days of early voting for all federal and statewide elections. So Michigan kind of joining the southern states and some of the western states and having that early in-person voting option. But in doing that, we had some initial challenges, which is, what is early voting turnout going to look like? What days will the voters show up, and then what times will the voters show up? I kind of analyzed Texas, Georgia, Florida, New York, states that had implemented early voting, looked at the turnout in the year that they had implemented it, the turnout for November, with the exception of Georgia, which is a huge anomaly in 2008. Really, in that first November election, coming in at just under 20% turnout seems to be kind of standard. And then, so I wanted to know what November might do. And then I also wanted to know kind of what this presidential primary was going to do. And that turnout, I assume, would be between 3% and 5%. I hit that one right on the nose. So that's kind of informing how many early voting sites I wanted to have. I was able to obtain the line tracker hourly turnout for early voting, which was in the Bipartisan Policy Center MIT line study, because voters behave a little bit different for early voting than they do on election day. And I had no historical data for Michigan. And then I looked at the daily turnout. I looked at Harris County, obtaining that information online for their 12 days of early voting, this entire state of Georgia for their 19 days of universal early voting. And then I picked Flagler County, Florida, because it's similar in size to Canton. What I noticed were weekends tended to be pretty low turnout, with the exception of the weekend prior to an election. That Saturday for Flagler County was their second highest day of early voting turnout. So now I've kind of got an idea of when voters might show up, what days they might vote, and then what my percentage of my population may choose to vote early. And that allowed me to kind of figure out how many early voting sites I was going to need. I used a free tool from the Center for Inclusive Democracy. It's their voting locator tool, which they have GIS data for the state of Michigan, lots of layers about voter behavior. I could see where my high voter registration numbers were. I could see where my high turnout areas were. And I could also see where my low vote by mail areas are. And I kind of identified those locations for where I wanted to put my early voting sites. I picked 2 community centers, the Summit on the Park, which is our kind of rec center in Canton, and then Village Arts Factory, which is a community village arts center. And that's because we could control those for all 9 days of our required early voting. When I did the math on our turnout for November, I decided I needed 2 sites based on how many people I think are going to be voting daily for early voting. And I set it up accordingly under the broccoli theory, that I wanted to train my voters for our February presidential primary, our August presidential primary, and our November election to know exactly where and when to early vote. So when you look at the February 27th presidential primary, the communities that chose early voting sites in high traffic areas with multiple existing ancillary activities, they saw the greatest participation. Talking about libraries and community centers. Ann Arbor had the highest early voting turnout. Detroit had the second highest, but that Detroit is being the largest city in Michigan by far. How was Ann Arbor able to achieve that? Well, they had 6 early voting sites, and they were able to overperform Detroit, which is roughly 5 times its population. by having 3 of those EV sites at public libraries and having evening hours, by having 2 of their sites at community centers with evening hours, and then 1 of their sites being at City Hall with their normal city hours. Of the 6 of the 7 highest EV communities use this model. Obviously, Canton Township used 2 community centers. Rochester Hills used their library. Macomb Township, a recreation center. West Bloomfield Township used their library as well. So for the purposes of promoting early voting, we had mandatory notice that had to be mailed to all voters. We obviously posted that notice in a newspaper, right? Which we all know isn't going to get the kind of traction that we think. And then we have our kind of built-in government social media accounts. But what I really wanted to do is try to ease the burden on election day. And so my target demographic, we're going to be an older demographic of individuals who may be inclined to vote on election day and not vote by mail. But they want that experience of showing up in person. So I used, outside of our normal promotion methods, we had 2 pretty large discussion groups on Facebook, right? This is my target demographic. And every single day I would post photos and maps of my early voting sites, discussing and educating voters about early voting, how it is a replica of election day. You get to put the ballot in the tabulator yourself as a way to propose to support that. And we saw that folks were showing up. It's a built-in constituency in this case of roughly 40,000 of my 70,000 registered voters, and gives them an opportunity to me to interact with them and educate them. On top of that, I used a passive email communication model, emails that we had on file for every voter who had requested an absentee ballot but had not returned them. As we got closer to election day, we get closer to that no mail zone. I start getting nervous because in Michigan, you need to have that ballot returned by 8 o'clock on election day in order for it to count. And mailing it closer to election day can become a danger. And so I sent out an email to all of the remaining mail or absentee ballots that were still in the hands of voters. And I educated them on a really cool feature that we had just implemented in Michigan, which is this notion that I can bring my absentee ballot to an early voting site and I can convert it into an early voting ballot, and I can put it in the tabulator myself. So I get the best of both worlds. So we educated on that for those folks who still had their ballots in their hands, and we also promoted that they use drop boxes and not mail those ballots back. What we saw is a large increase in the number of folks who were going to our early voting sites, because at this time there were, I think, roughly 7,000 absentee ballots still out. And then we use an active email. This is the first time we had ever done this. Michigan does not have a long history of doing voter education or voter engagement. We have had a very passive system, partially because it's so decentralized, and it's been a bit of a cottage industry up until recently with the new reforms. We've allowed voters to kind of We've put the burden on the voter for interacting with the election system. And this is our first time actively engaging voters. We currently have about emails on file for about half of the voters who are registered in Canton Township. On day 6 of early voting, we had sent an email out to all registered voters in Canton Township, notifying them with an election alert that that we had that Sunday was going to be the last day of early voting. We had images and maps to get them to the early voting site, and educated them on the early voting process, that you will come in, you'll show an ID, you'll get your ballot, you'll put it in the tabulator just like election day. And we kept hitting that just like election day to try to convert those folks to vote in a more convenient model for them. And what we saw for day 7, 8, and 9 is we started doubling our early voting turnout once voters knew that that existed. For future elections, we're going to be, this was all free, right? But for future elections, we're going to be using an email kind of management software that will allow folks to opt out of the active email component of this. Additionally, you're going to want to look at, depending on your state laws, on how you can communicate with those voters, on some of our forms for converting voters to for getting their phone numbers and their emails. We're looking at putting a box that would indicate that they are okay or comfortable receiving communications for future elections, and that they are comfortable with mass text as well, so that we can comply with federal communication requirements. That's how we've used communication in the last couple of years in Canton Township.
All right, fantastic, Michael. Thank you so much. Great, three fantastic presentations, and I hope that you can all see ways in which you can take pieces of this and incorporate it into your elections as well. We don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to ask a question. And you know what? I'm going to jump into the third rail of questions because we got one and I got a personal one on my cell. So let's just talk about it. So one of the things that's sort of in the news right now is whether there are lots of non-citizens that are registered to vote and whether fraud will be a big problem in this upcoming election. We've got a couple of those questions. So I'll just start it, and then I want to hear maybe like 30 seconds from everybody else. You might not believe this or may not appreciate this, but this is actually something that elections administrators take very seriously, are very active in trying to combat, because we want our elections to be as fair and secure as we can make them. All the people on the screen and those elections officials in your states and around the country, we all consider ourselves the referees. We don't consider ourselves combatants. We're not on one side or the other. And so we're not trying to game the system for any particular group or outcome. And so I would just note that the states represented here have pretty good automatic voter registration systems. These are systems where people register to vote at their DMV when they get their driver's license or they get their state ID. That's the very best way. That's the gold standard of registration, because that's when you have a person standing in front of another person providing two forms of ID and demonstrating that they are who they say they are, and that registration then goes in and is provided to the local or state election official. So really good way to do registration. So if you hear in the world AVR is bad, no, it's not. AVR is good. The other thing is that the states here represent ERIC very well, so the Electronic Registration Information Center. Sorry, Tommy, you'll get there eventually. But the ERIC is another great way in which we actually do find people who are either registered fraudulently or voting fraudulently. And because we can compare across states, I can see Michael's registration as it compares to Colorado's registration. And I can see, oh, he's got somebody that's registered in his jurisdiction that's also registered in ours. And so that information then goes to Maysa. Maysa and her team updates that record or sends a mailing to make sure that that person is appropriately registered. So there are lots of things that we can do as election officials that maybe you don't understand or appreciate that are actually really good, but the conversation about those things is not as good. And that conversation, frankly, is misinformation. Those people are typically trying to get you to believe something that's really not true. Let me pass it to, I'll start with Maysa. And, what do you think about the question of voter fraud and non-citizens voting? And, how does that sort of color the way that you're thinking about the upcoming election?
I think you did a good job covering, Judd, what Colorado does now. The easiest way to check is via a voter's ID. Voters in Colorado who are not citizens are issued a specific driver's license that indicates that they're not a citizen. And our statewide voter registration system also performs a HAVA check every time we register someone to vote. So it's examining records from other counties, other states, and making sure that we're not duplicating a record elsewhere. And then it also checks all of our records in Colorado and provides you a list of potential matches that you have to examine before you can continue to register the voter. In terms of voter fraud in general in the election, I think a lot of, I guess I can only speak to Colorado, but Colorado has a lot of things in place to prevent that. Our signature verification is pretty stringent, and we're able to let a voter know pretty quickly whether their ballot is rejected due to a signature discrepancy. Voters are contacted via email if they have it on file. We also, because we have a statewide registration system, we can see whether a voter has voted in another county and therefore not allow them to vote in our county or vice versa. So I think that there are a lot of things in place to prevent voter fraud. It's not something that is at the top of my concern for this upcoming election. My concerns would much more be along misinformation or disinformation lines.
Great. Thank you, Maysa. Tommy?
Yeah, I'll just say that, this is an opportunity, for something like the coalition to really try to educate the public in terms of all the checks and balances that, that we as election officials are required to perform in order to, deal with this idea of non-citizens that are voting. And so, this might be an emerging issue. I mean, it is an emerging issue. That's something that is an opportunity for the coalition to work on over the summer to deliver that message in the fall. So I look at it more kind of procedurally. What would we do? What would we say? If we had the opportunity to test it, that we'd be able to do so, to be able to deliver an even stronger message to the public during that time as we approach the November election.
Yeah, great. And Michael?
Judd, your intro and everything that the panelists have set up to this point is pretty spot on with regards to kind of the two key things we do in election administration, which is A, ensure that the individual who is registered to vote is a qualified voter, and then B, that the individual who is requesting a ballot, whether it's in person or by mail, is the person who is legally entitled to that ballot. We use obviously the biometrics that was talked about before with regards to the signature verification or the physical ID in person. Michigan does have an affidavit option for folks who may not have their ID on them. There's still a signature verification for that after the fact, and 99.5% of our voters have that driver's license and that ID. And then additionally, we're complying with NVRA. We've got that federal ID requirement that it's going to say that they're going to have a driver's license, so they're going to have the last four of their social security number. It's going to identify that individual. Michigan did two kind of key things in 2018 during that period of time. One, we instituted automatic voter registration, which is cool. So for the bulk of the voters who are registered, they're not necessarily registering through that voter registration drive or that mail process where there could be errors on the sheet. We have their address, we have an identification number with them, and we know it's a good, clean record of a human that's registering to vote through that process, and they're doing it through the DMV or Secretary of State. But then also at the same time of kind of cleaning the list up on that end, ensuring that we have good, clean data, we also joined ERIC, and at that point that flagged over 500,000 voters to start that NVRA countdown to have them removed. Michigan saw a massive population loss for over a decade. The states that Michigan residents moved to were Florida, Ohio, and Texas are kind of the top three states. Unfortunately, in the last year and a half, all three of those states have left ERIC due to, ironically enough, voter integrity concerns by some folks, by mostly partisan actors. And so the problem with that is obviously that does harm us with regards to folks being registered in multiple states. But again, there's still things we can do to kind of to catch that. And then, so voter fraud, given the history of election administration over 240 years in this country, and given like the technical professionalism in elections today, I think massive concerns about large scale fraud tend to be more cultural or partisan or philosophical than actual bore out in the data. And I think, prosecutions and court cases kind of show that mathematically we're more inclined to harm someone's right to vote, not through dilution, through fraud, but through technical errors with technology in the precinct that might result in people leaving and having to go to work and not being able to make it back, or people's ballots getting lost in the mail or not getting back in time. Those tend to be more dangerous to the election system as it relates to harming a voter, as opposed to this notion of fraud, which I think is more philosophical than technical.
All right, so fantastic. They did a great job of explaining, much better than I did. You guys did a great job of explaining that. So I guess to speak to the point, voter fraud is a huge issue, but it's a huge issue from a conversation point of view, from a sort of misinformation. How do I explain what I do well so that people have trust in the election and the outcome? And less so about, I mean, we already have the ways in place that we guard against that. And even when somebody sort of does thread the needle, we're typically going to find that because we're all comparing information after the election. Except for you, Tommy. California, someday, I know you'll join.
Well, we have our state to state, that's the one thing, is at least we're comparing our 58 states within California. So that's a starting point.
Yeah, that's right. Internal, that's good. All right. Well, hey, so fantastic panel. Thank you so much to Maysa, Tommy, and Michael. Really appreciate you joining us today. Their presentations will be made available. So if you saw something on the presentation you really want to follow up on, that's going to be available on the website when we post this. So thank you all three. Appreciate you.